going through your book, you were really thorough. Like you went through a lot of topics. You talked about the history of the plant and the endocannabinoid system. The first part, you break up with alcohol, and I found that what I've noticed, especially during this pandemic, is that there are a lot of people who are turning to alcohol at the beginning, and now they're switching to cannabis. I think people are looking for something that's not as toxic.
And it came to a point in my life where it just wasn't worth it in terms of how I would feel the next day. Even with, moderate, light to moderate drinking, I get migraine headaches, and, I would just feel like I wasn't, there for my kids the next day if I didn't feel good. It's hard to parent well if you are uncomfortable. So I did some research with individual canna moms or weed moms out there. And then, I surveyed groups. There's lots of Facebook groups, et cetera. And, and I put together a survey and I asked people to fill it out. And I found that a huge number of moms in particular who had found cannabis either, during the pandemic or before, have started to make that transition, that switch from alcohol to cannabis, or, their alcohol consumption is just really reduced.
What I found really interesting about your approach, and I think what makes that you wrote the book so good, you weren't really, you weren't really into cannabis because your husband had a problem with cannabis, and that kind of gave you sort of a negative view of it, as you said in the book. And then over time, you kind of fell into it. But while your husband was going into treatment, my girlfriends and we've talked about cannabis and how we use it for anxiety and depression. But where's that line? Especially because as advocates, we're like, come on, moms, you can use cannabis, it's better. But I think a lot of women want to know, where's the line where it's becoming a problem and when it's therapeutic?
Yeah, and it was so important for me to include because, I am an advocate. Absolutely. I know how helpful and healing this plant can be, but I also know that, just like anything, we can overuse it or we can rely on it too much. And so chapter 9 that you're referencing talks about cannabis use disorder and some other things that, could go wrong with cannabis use. And I think that for me, cannabis is about enhancing my presence and mindfulness. It's not about checking out. And so being mindful just always with our consumption, I think, is important. But, there are questions to ask yourself. If you find yourself, for instance, using more and more and more cannabis just to achieve the same effect, then that might be a good time for a tolerance break, for just, backing off a little bit and resetting that, which is actually, for most people, only a couple of days is enough. Things like getting cranky if you can't use it, planning your day around, using it, that sort of thing. Although, of course, if you're using cannabis in a wellness or a therapeutic way, there are, really significant ways that you can plan your intake for your activities. I'm not saying it like that. I might say, hey, I want to take a nice walk in my neighborhood. I just, finished my work and I have a little time to myself. I'm going to elevate and then I'm going to go on a walk. And so that sort of planning is perfectly fine. Planning your day around, those sorts of things is perfectly fine. But if it's like, oh, I have an invitation to go hang out socially or something for work, but I'm not going to do it because I can't use cannabis, that might be something that,
Right.
You'd want to think about if it's changing or sort of curtailing your life and your activities. We want it to enhance and to make us more, present and available for the world, not less.
Other thing I wanted to talk about in your book, you mentioned how you didn't know what to buy. So you went into the cannabis store and you bought a vape pen and some cookies. And then I noticed that you mentioned about the dose thing. And I'm like, oh, it's a dosist pen. That's a good one to buy when you're new, because then it limits how much you can inhale, because vape pens can be really strong. But then you had, when you kept it in your drawer for a while and you didn't use it, you had this guilt around using cannabis, calling yourself a stoner, and you felt like you shouldn't be doing it. And I think a lot of women, that is the sort of problem, for them for using it, is this one is feeling really overwhelmed, going and what do I buy? And the second thing is then it's like this guilt about using it. What was the thing that kind of just finally was like, you know what, I'm just going to do it for you?
So I was writing about cannabis without actually being an enthusiast yet, without really, I had experiences in college and I had smoked here and there with my husband, but I just, like I said in the book, I didn't understand it. It wasn't my go-to because it just felt like there was no rhyme or reason to it, to me. Because again, I didn't get CBD and THC ratios. I didn't get terpenes. Like we didn't have information. Also, read and talked to many, many people who said, hey, it helps me with anxiety. It helps me sleep. It helps me, socialize. It helps me be present with my kids or do my creative stuff. And I thought, I mean, I'm not really somebody to just rely on other people's experience to form my opinion. So I was like, I got to figure this out for myself. I took literally one hit of a dosist pen, one puff, which is, I think, 2.5 milligrams, 2.25, very low. It was just enough to give me a really embodied, experience on my yoga mat. I rolled out my yoga mat and I did this very intentionally. And I said, I want to see what this is about. And it turns out it was a beautiful experience and something that I felt like could enhance my life in the future, could really contribute if I just was a little more open-minded and let it in.
So what does your cannabis routine look like now?
So I love my CBD tinctures and definitely take them in the evenings and once in a while during the day. If I'm feeling a little anxious, they do help. I generally reserve THC for after like 4:30 or 5 o'clock because I can't work very well with THC. Low doses, sure, 1 milligram, 5 milligrams. But generally speaking, I use cannabis toward the end of my workday in order to transition from like work to home. Obviously, we're all home all the time because it's a pandemic, but my kids are schooling upstairs in their bedrooms and I'm working down here and we interact throughout the day. But, in terms of transitioning from, okay, my main focus is work to my main focus is my family, that's really helpful for me.
We're moms and we have our kids and we're using our cannabis. And one thing that you do talk about in your book is talking to your kids about cannabis. So what do your kids know about cannabis? I think your kids are about the same age as mine. Mine are 6 years old and 10 years old.
Okay. Mine are 8 and 11 now. So very close.
A little bit older.
Yeah. A little bit older.
But
yeah.
So do they know mom writes about cannabis and do they know about the plant? Like how much do they know?
Yes. So I would say in the past year and a half since this, or 2 years, even since the book project has been underway, they have learned quite a bit about cannabis. Although I spoke to them before, it wasn't like it was a mystery before that. So I first spoke to them probably when they were about 4 and 7 years old. And because it was becoming something that I was writing about, their dad had obviously been to, he had to go to rehab, as you mentioned. So he was away for 5 weeks from the family. Obviously, that's something we had to talk about and process as a family. So it was just present enough in our lives that I needed to speak about it at that point. Right now, my kids know it's a plant. They know that it's not safe for them yet. I've shown them what edibles look like. I keep my stash locked, absolutely. But, I want them to know that if they were ever to come across, a gummy package at somebody's house and it has the THC sign on it, the pot leaf symbol on it, that's something they should stay away from. That isn't healthy. That if they were to eat that as a kid, they would feel sick and we might have to go to the hospital. But I don't want to, instill fear. I say I use it, to treat some certain things like my headaches. I also use it because I enjoy it and it's fun and it's relaxing. And they know, they are aware that when I have moderate elevation with cannabis, I'm a better mom. Like I'm actually more fun to be around. I'm more creative. I'm more present. So for them, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like something that, that helps. So, I do go in the book through different ages and appropriate conversations to have at those different ages. And, it's not like a one size fits all conversation, but I do think it's important to talk about it, to normalize it.
There's the book.
There it is. That's the cover. And she's got her, lollipop and you can tell she's a mom. Funny story. The very first cover was this minus the bunny, but she had like spit up on her shoulder.
Okay, yeah.
And I was like, too graphic. Let's try a different indication that she's a mom.
Yeah. Oh, well, I love the book and congratulations again. Do you have anything coming out or do you planning on more books or what are your future plans?
Right now I'm just promoting this book. We'll see. I think in the future I could envision a possible follow-up, Weed Mom 2.0, talking about, more advanced stuff and, tolerance breaks and, new products and all that kind of stuff. But for now, I'm just focusing on this one.